Silence my phone while we're doing this. Great.
Hi, Shahid.
Hey, Alice. Great to be with you. How are you?
I'm so excited that you said yes to this interview. You are actually the first person who gave a warning that I heard that fascism was on its way almost 10 years ago. So really excited to have you on this call. So let me introduce myself, introduce you, you can introduce you. So I'm Alice Leibowitz. I'm the founder of Conversations Against Fascism. We help activists, organizations, and movements grapple with the rising threat of fascism and step into effective action. And we offer workshops, retreats, and group discussions about mostly about developing emotional, interpersonal, and collaborative skills to change the course of history. And Shahid, I don't remember the names of the organizations that you've worked with, but I know that you have a career as a civil rights lawyer, a civil liberties lawyer, and that you're also, and history as a grassroots activist, including as an occupier, and that now you are running as a progressive to unseat Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House. Anything else we should know about you, your background, what you're up to now?
When you'd located that time that I guess you were describing the conversation about fascism 10 years ago, just noting that at the time I was at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and proud to have led that organization then. That was another era. So it's a bit of a blast from the past, but yeah, it's great to see you again and excited to have this conversation. Great.
So when you, so what I remember you saying in 2012, 2013 was some of the legislation and policies restricting civil liberties that were coming down the pike at that time, like the indefinite detention, and I don't remember what else, reminded you of laws that were being passed in the 1920s and 30s in Central Europe. And so what were some of those laws, and what was happening in Central Europe and what was happening here 10 years ago, and what are the parallels?
So, some of them, if you look at the denial, for instance, of asylum rights and migrant rights, that's very central to the fascist enterprise, both then, there, and here now. Surveillance as a modality, and we can drill into some of the different policies of all these, but just to press on them: executive secrecy, the fusion of private and public, that is to say the privatization of human rights abuses and the opportunity for somebody to make a buck off them, forced sterilization. I could go on. Let's just maybe start with the border, because I think that's where it sort of becomes clearest. And I might even back into this with an observation I heard from some border advocates at Al Otro Lado. It's an organization on the Mexican border near San Diego. They do work particularly in solidarity with asylum seekers. And this might be jarring for Americans to understand. It was jarring for me to hear at the time. I think this was 2019, July, I learned this. The US government, State Department, coordinates with Mexican authorities to deny some US citizens the right to leave the United States through the southern border because they've been identified as human rights activists. Think about that for a second. The militarization of the border, not just as a pretext to keep everyone out, but as a pretext to keep some people in based on their speech. And this was years ago, and it's only gotten worse. And this is a perfect example of which measures taken in the name supposedly of enforcing immigration law ultimately become cornerstones of authoritarianism, applicable not just to immigrants, but here to American citizens. And it's so, the layers of offensiveness are even worse than they might seem, because it's not just the militarization of the border. It's not just the denial of the right to egress to American citizens. It's the denial of the right of egress to American citizens based on their speech. I mean, it's so constitutionally offensive. It would be straight out of a fascist country, you might say. And so, that's one example. to look at the border, still within the realm of immigration enforcement, we could tell a similar story about biometric collection. And I think this was one of the things I might have been talking about back in 2012, but I don't want to just like, ramble on if that's interesting or if it's within the conversation, you tell me.
But what I remember indefinite detention was one of the things. Basically, the picture that I remember you painting was the groundwork was being laid for totalitarianism. Not that, and what I remember with indefinite detention is that Obama said, I will never use this against American citizens on American soil, which already is not that much of a restriction, right? Could use it on American citizens somewhere else, could use it on anybody who was born anywhere else. But he's saying, me, the constitutional law professor who happens to be president, I'll sign this into law, but I won't abuse it to the full extent. And we all said, well, that's great, but you won't be there forever. Someone down the line could show up. And then, of course, the very next person was a racist authoritarian. So I didn't understand all the legalities of, what was happening. And I hadn't had no knowledge of that history in 20th century Europe, right? Like the precursors to the Third Reich, the legislative and they didn't have constitutions exactly, but
it was legalized. It was a very legalized framework, the accretion of power, not very dissimilar here. And I think that maybe is what you're kind of referring to, right? It wasn't a military coup. This was a legalized process then and now.
Yeah. And so what would you say are are some of the ways that like our Constitution has been deliberately weakened that set the stage for Trumpism to be so dangerous? Like even before he got there, or even before anyone knew he was more than a television actor.
Right. I mean, before I maybe dive into the question, just to react to the Trumpism piece, I think of fascism as much bigger than Trump, and unfortunately enduring well beyond him. I wish that Trumpism were the problem, but unfortunately it's just like the part of an iceberg that sticks above the water. And precisely what I was talking about in 2012, where the parts below the water, right? So I don't really think of it as Trumpism in the first instance, but in terms of the constitutional erosions, and then maybe we can come back to some of the surveillance, immigration, detention issues, because I see all that as, foundational to some extent. But remind me, I want to go back to the question to make sure I'm hitting what you wanted to talk about.
What do you see as some of the fundamental ways that the Constitution was deliberately
it's the deliberately
eviscerated prior to the things that prior to the iceberg becoming visible?
Right. So there are lots of different points at which the Constitution has been systematically dismantled. The deliberately part is hard to grip because that would imply agency on the part of someone pulling marionette strings, whereas it's too complicated a process for that. I mean, there are many people, those marionette string pullers include members of Congress and members of the Supreme Court, justices of the Supreme Court, presidents, their staffs in all of those different arenas, but it's not as if any one person can guide that. It took a lot of people to engineer, for instance, the erosion of Fourth Amendment rights in the context of digital technology submitting everyone to state omniscience, and the attendant erosion of First Amendment rights to association, particularly, which no one even acknowledges here. I mean, people talk about Fourth Amendment privacy standards. They maybe will talk about First Amendment speech. Like nobody ever talks about the way that pervasive surveillance undermines the right of association and the freedom to associate with whomever you want. This is particularly pernicious for immigrants because the most lurking threats to undocumented people in terms of digital security are usually not themselves, but their friends. And the sort of vicarious security interests are, what get implicated here. And the fact that, it's not just the Fourth Amendment interests of the people who are using technology, it's the right of association of their immigrant friends who are put at risk if you use technology carelessly. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. These are intersections that even escape attention, even by advocates. The courts have been largely asleep at the switch entirely It's hard to reflect on this without thinking about the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment and the way that's just been directly thrown out the window, by allowing impunity for torture and elevating its architects to the leadership of the CIA. That's what's happened in the last 10 years. But the Fifth Amendment's implicated here. That's due process standards, certainly the First and its various rights. If we're looking at the First Amendment, I would actually look particularly at the rights of the press and the ways, for instance, at the moment Julian Assange is being subjected to a bipartisan prosecution. And there's two layers to this. There's the First Amendment constitutional piece, and then I want to get beyond it to the press ethics, beyond the press rights. So, one of the parts of the Constitution that's been dismantled here is the right of the press to inform the public about government crimes, to enable electoral accountability. That's kind of core to the democratic design. It's why there is a freedom of press in the First Amendment. And it's particularly why it is so incredibly problematic for the Justice Department to prosecute a publisher whose crimes include exposing the US military assassinating Reuters journalists. But it's worse than that, because it's not just the open assault on the right of the press to inform the public by the Justice Department that's problematic here. Every press organization in the entire United States with any broadcast audience is completely complicit in suppressing even the fact of the Assange trial. And I want to contrast this with the earlier era, at least in the United States, that some people might be very proud of when we brought down the Nixon administration and the press rising to expose government corruption in the war in Vietnam, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Ellsberg came forward with the Pentagon Papers, I think it was 17 different newspapers, over a dozen around the country, cooperated to make sure that the public got to read them. And when the Justice Department came after one newspaper after another to shut down the publication of the secret analysis of how the official story of the war in Vietnam was a hoax, exposing to the public that the whole thing was a racket, one newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, the New York Times, I think the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was in on it. It went around the country. 17 different newspapers fought the Justice Department, and they kept losing, but they kept passing it on, and they ended up exposing the whole document. And there's no way something like that would happen today, because today, faced with a very similar situation, the Justice Department just says, we're going to prosecute a publisher, and then all the rest of them fall in line. And it's not the prosecution of Assange in particular that worries me, though it is a crux, it is a door to another world that we're about to step through. Mm-hmm. It is the reality in which reporting on government crimes is a crime. That is, it's so obviously corrupt that it is shameful and shameless of the American, not just legal system, but the media establishment, the businesses that report the news, are just not showing up for work. And in doing that, they're undermining not just their own rights, not just their own interests, our rights to know what they're supposed to tell us about. They're eroding their very capacity to inform the public. And that's a layer of this equation, when we talk
about their own hands.
Say again?
They're cutting off their own hands.
Precisely. Right. Hands that are supposed to ultimately serve the public too. And so what does that mean? It means that our democracy is left effectively blind to the abuses that will happen behind veils of executive secrecy that no journalist will have the independence to try to look through. This is the Assange prosecution has to be looked at through the lens of intimidating the press and sending signals to future publishers what you can and what you cannot do. And if what you're doing involves exposing a crime by the US government, well, then you're not First Amendment protected. You're going to be prosecuted as a spy under the Espionage Act. That's what's happening right now. And the idea that a country that helped introduce democracy to the modern world is going to be prosecuting publishers because they exposed government crimes is a heinous travesty. And I dare say that the founders of our country, generations of jurists and lawyers and activists in our nation's history, they are all rolling in their graves at the moment, because this in particular is a crux that I don't know if our democracy can withstand the loss of the freedom of the press. It's supposed to be, there's lots of things here that are supposed to work in concert, and they're all breaking at once.
They're all breaking. So I want to back up and clarify what you were saying about freedom of association. So were you saying that because of the way social media is social, that people are getting prosecuted for things or getting tracked down through their friends, or like, tell me more about what you were saying there.
That's happening too. I mean, the to describe what you were describing, I was in a documentary called Terror with the T in parentheses, so error preceded by a T, and it's a story of a white American convert to Islam, identified by the FBI as interesting based on his Facebook posts, who is then monitored for months, coercively recruited. He was going to speak at the National Press Club about the FBI, trying to pressure him to serve as an informant when they then arrested him on a gun charge. And that was based entirely on social media and what he was saying online. So more speech than who he was saying it to. When I'm talking about immigrants and their friends, there, what I mean to say is that if you're undocumented and you're taking some pains to remain private from the state, you can do that. But then because other people might not be as careful, it means that you can't associate freely with anyone. And so the denial of the right to associate for people who can't be public because of the way other people are being pervasively watched is a part of the puzzle that nobody even thinks about. Like, people think about privacy as, oh, someone's watching me, or someone's spying on my financial transactions, or someone's exerting pressure so I can't believe or speak or say or write or publish this. That's all part of speech in the First Amendment. Here I'm talking about the vicarious interest in association by a third party, which is to say, oh, I have a friend who can't write to me, because if they write to me, then the fact that we know each other might be known to this government agency that's always looking for people like that. And like, that might sound really paranoid, except there are multiple government agencies that exist solely for the purpose of identifying undocumented immigrants and ultimately deporting them. And we're about 20 years into that endeavor. And actually, this draws me full circle back to the other part. We were reflecting on ways in which attacks on immigrant rights in particular portend and forebode and create threats to the rights of all Americans. And we talked before about the context at the border. Just to press on this, and this kind of gets at the associational harm, and an example of that in the biometric surveillance arena. Well, this isn't so much associational. Yeah, it is, but well, you'll see it. I'm being a little cute describing it that way, but I'll try to unpack that as we go. There was two programs under the Obama administration, 287G and the Secure Communities Initiative. These were both different immigration enforcement programs that aimed to effectively decentralize the endeavor of immigration enforcement so that it was no longer exclusively a project of federal agencies. The idea of engaging state and local operators and agencies and enforcing federal immigration law. The 287G basically allowed things like, this was a long time ago, I think it was SB 10. This was the Arizona bill that particularly subjected undocumented immigrants to pervasive racial and creed profiling by local authorities. And so 287G was the federal gateway for states to do things like that. The other part of this initiative, the Secure Communities Initiative, I want to zero in on that. And we're going to share basically a story about how what was presented to the public as a tool to identify criminal suspects who are undocumented immigrants and fast track their deportation ultimately became the thin edge of a wedge to create a national biometric tracking scheme that the FBI has built that now includes biometric identifiers for more or less every American, co-opting agencies, including departments of motor vehicles, and the photos that you take to get your driver's license. So Secure Communities is supposed to be a program where anybody who gets booked for a criminal offense gets fingerprinted, maybe their retinas get scanned, biometric identifiers get taken, and the whole point is they're going to get compared to federal databases. And if they're not a citizen and they've been arrested, well, we want to fast track their deportation and get them out of the country. It's kind of an authoritarian response in the first instance. But and there's lots of things we could say about the rights of the accused here, but I want to look not at the rights of the accused, but and the accused here, not just of criminal offenses, but immigration offenses, but the people who are not accused of immigration offenses, who might be accused of other things. All their biometrics get swept in too. So you're formally in the collection process looking beyond immigrants. So that's how the FBI built the Next Generation Initiative. NGI. The whole time that Secure Communities was operating as an immigration enforcement program, it was always a ruse for a broader project called the Next Generation Initiative. This ultimately came out in litigation. A bunch of groups, the NDLON stands for the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, sued with an immigration law clinic at Cardozo Law School, I believe. Somebody else was with them. I can't remember all the parties, but they sued under the Freedom of Information Act and got the documents proving that the FBI was basically lying to the public. And now they've collected hundreds of millions of biometric records without a legislative mandate on the backs of immigrants, using us as punching bags to get the public to accept things that they would never even contemplate if they were transparently presented. And just another data point, another example of this pattern of fascism and authoritarianism emerging from selective abuses targeting marginal populations that then unfortunately expand. And to use the words of, a thinker from another era, become chickens that come home to roost.
So what I'm actually hearing is it's not just that authoritarianism is on the rise, and therefore when immigrants or other unpopular ethnic groups get targeted, there's no cap on how bad the abuses can be, as did happen in Nazi Germany, right? Because there was authoritarianism, death camps were allowable, right? So it's not just that relationship between authoritarianism and immigration, but it's also the reverse, that the immigration panic is enabling the civil liberties erosion. I think
it was the same thing in Central Europe, frankly.
Really,
the marginalization of communities is what enabled the emergence of authoritarianism. The protections don't collapse on their own. You've got to target somebody to use these powers against in order to establish them, and then they expand.
I had a friend, socialist occupier friend, who quoted someone as saying that mass incarceration of Black people was a counterinsurgency before the insurgency. Like, it was a trial balloon. Or not a trial balloon. Obviously, it has other purposes, but one of the purposes seemed to be to sharpen how the horrible and abusive the government could be by targeting a group that wasn't actually in active revolution, so that they could be prepared with those techniques when there wasn't revolution, or in case there was a revolution.
I hear the analysis. I guess I'd maybe even go back to the same place, in the sense that, like, mass incarceration, we have to understand mass incarceration in the context of the CIA running drugs into LA and Miami. And so that all wraps back. It was part and process of this exact saga that we're depicting. It was between the time that Eisenhower warned us this was all going to happen and the time that the Justice Department starts subpoenaing people based on the websites that they visit about potential protests at the White House, there was a spectrum of things that happened in between. And, when the CIA was lying to the public about selling weapons to Iran, after it had held dozens of Americans hostages for months, to fund its rogue foreign policy in Nicaragua, to then drive 2.5 million Black and brown people into prison where they became legally enslaved, that is all similarly an example of fascism and authoritarianism accreting. What your friend described as a trial balloon, I would describe as like one wall of the foundation. And this is, the metaphor of a frog being boiled in water fits. Each discrete act is like laying a brick in a wall. And when judges lost discretionary sentencing authority, that was a brick in a wall. Every time a prosecutor gets appointed to the judiciary and sits in judgment of their former colleagues to stack the deck against every accused person, that's a brick in a wall. Every time, a supposedly liberal justice or nominally liberal justice dies on the court without strategically retiring to contrive the partisan affiliation of their potential replacement, that's a major brick in a wall You know, every time you have Democratic senators brag about putting right-wing justices on the Supreme Court, which happened both with Feinstein and Barrett and with Biden and Clarence Thomas, that's like an entire wall, not just a brick, you know, that's getting put up. And so it's a death by more than 1,000 cuts. And all of the different things that comprise the criminal justice abuses, from Clarence Thomas being put on the Supreme Court to the 1993 crime bill, to judges losing discretionary sentencing authority, you know, faux science being used by prosecutors to convict people on the basis of, you know, lies. Basically, this has all been going on for decades, and it accretes. And it's not, as you were saying before, it's not just an opportunity for the state to assert itself because its powers are already well established. These are the ways that the powers emerge, and, you know, by agencies. And it's worth making this clear too. It's not just the case that the CIA lied to the public, sold weapons to Iran, funded a revolution somewhere else where they were abusing human rights in another part of the world, and then drove 2.5 million people, Americans, into slavery. All those things happened, and then the architects of that got rewarded and promoted, and the agency got more money. Its budget is classified to this day, and that was 40 years ago. I mean, you know, these are issues that escape attention, but, you know, when you look at them through the lens that connects the dots between these discrete moments, you know, the whole is unfortunately a great deal worse than the sum of its sordid parts.
So for people who are noticing that something is happening, right? For people who, I mean, I thought about backing up what you said about a frog boiling in water. I mean, the revelations that Edward Snowden gave us, you know, 10 years ago, that the government was literally spying on literally everyone.
Yeah.
Were very shocking. And yet I feel like we all adapted. Right. I spent a few days thinking I'm going to get a different email account. I don't want to be on Gmail. They're spying on Gmail. And then it didn't work very, you know, the email address I tried didn't work. And I gave up, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll just try to remember that I'm being spied on. And I adapted that quickly. And I'm sure, you know, people who are in more denial probably adapted a lot faster. I suspect that there were moderates out there who were like, well, that's just normal. Of course, the government's spying on us. But each piece as it gets revealed, gets normalized.
That's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that's interesting here in terms of the possibility emerging of democratic accountability and policies that carve a different direction is precisely that the communities that are offended by these kinds of programs tend not to be the same ones that array themselves on opposite sides of a predictable gridlock. In other words, the surveillance apparatus, excuse me, it offends progressives and libertarians alike. And so you don't have to necessarily be of a particular ideological ilk to share these concerns. And that enables the prospect of democratic accountability if we, the people of the United States, are able to overcome our tribalisms enough to, you know, establish our rights, or, you know, walk and chew gum at the same time, or fight our way out of a paper bag. You know, all of those analogies kind of fit, because it's ultimately tools of our own creation that have shackled us. And, you know, these are prisons of our own making.
So so that's where I was going next. Like, what actions do you see that people can take once we realize that this is serious?
The very first one I want to raise up, I've been talking about this in the wake of Alito's leaked draft opinion and the case poised to overturn Roe. So a lot of people are responding to that decision as if it has been formalized, and it has not yet. Someone went to some pains to alert the public that that was coming. There's a lot of theories about who might have done it. And there's a lot of outrage on the right, supposedly, about the sanctity of the court being violated, which is complete horseshit, coming from people who lied through their teeth at their confirmation hearings and are laying waste to settled precedents that millions of people have relied on for decades. So I don't take that self-serving
righteousness seriously. Sure.
So I particularly do think, however, that this was probably someone on the liberal side trying to give civil society a chance to head the train off before it gets to the pass. And there's only one way to do that. We know that Washington does not care at all about what we, the people, say, want, or need. We also know that Washington will race at the drop of a hat to serve the needs of capital. And that's a bipartisan commitment. Now, on the one hand, the justices are supposed to be formally insulated from political pressure or accountability. That's why we have life tenure. Just incidentally, to put a flag in that, that's a whole other conversation. Life tenure and imposing term limits is a thing I want to do there to help fix another hole in the bucket that's been there from the beginning. And now I've gone and distracted myself.
Accountability through the pocketbook.
Thank you. So the one thing that will force the court to shift positions, despite the fact that the justices are formally insulated from political pressure, they're quite political animals. We can see that in every one of their rulings, right? That's the thing that a lot of people are finally waking up to see. This has been for me unavoidably obvious since my early days as a lawyer, because the very first decision I ever got to pay close attention to by the Supreme Court, decided the first year I started law school, was the Bush versus Gore decision. And that kind of laid bare the pretense that law is in any way separate from politics. So having seen a politicized judiciary for the 20 years that I've been a lawyer only grow more and more overtly weaponized against principles that used to be the objects of consensus, I recognize the way to intimidate the court, and I'm not afraid to say it in those terms, is for blue states to boycott now states that, should Roe fall, be poised to deny women's rights. It's the only thing that will stop the case from being formalized, and it would work. And it worked before. In 2016, North Carolina passed a bill basically denying trans folks access to the bathroom of their choice. And people were very concerned for lots of different reasons. It subjected people to potential risk for violence. And North Carolina walked it back within a year because artists stopped playing concerts there and conferences started getting canceled. And the state government felt a hit. The one thing that unites Washington is interstate commerce and a commitment to growing capital. If there's a threat to interstate capital, especially at any scale, and let's just be concrete about this. California could lead, and other states will follow. If a state as big as California, frankly, if any state starts boycotting red states, that will force the court to put the needs to cohere the union and guard the economic compact of the Constitution, which is ultimately what was its uniting principle at the beginning, before its political attack on the rights of women, girls, non-binary folks, and trans folks. And, the idea of denying, not just, we already deny a right to healthcare, but banning medical procedures is bad enough. That's straight. And then, forced pregnancy, all of these things are like straight out of the authoritarian playbook. So if we locate this in the context of the broader project of fascism, this whole endeavor could be yet another crux, in the same way that the CIA running drugs into LA and Miami was a crux, but we can stop this one. It hasn't happened yet. And I see a lot of people marching, and I'm all for it. I was marching this weekend and the weekend before, gone to Pelosi's house in the last week. The one thing we can do to change the direction of the future, instead of merely responding to what we think is already baked in the sauce, is to start passing these boycotts now. And that can happen. Nothing's holding us back.
And I mean, you've talked about a lot of these powerful, entrenched, insulated institutions, the CIA, the FBI, the Supreme Court. And to some extent, Congress.
Very much so, yeah.
What can people or movements do to turn the tide when the horrors are happening on such elevated levels?
So there's this whole principle of thinking global and acting local. So nobody can swallow the elephant. We have to chop it up and feed it to ourselves, right? And so a big part of this is about building networks that can be resilient. I talk about mutual aid largely in the context of enabling the possibility of a general strike. It becomes even more crucial in this context. A lot of people think about that as an economic lever in a class war, and it is. It's also the I don't want to use the name of it's the supreme card to play by a people to resist tyrannical government. It's why we have a Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is a right to resist. And I would not in any way encourage people to bear arms as a means of resistance, but things like boycotts, refusals to work stoppages en masse are the ultimate tool of resistance. It is the thing that can grind the gears to a halt. It is the one thing that can stop, even if all the levers get put in place. We will always have that as a potential theoretical option. The question is it real or not? And so mutual aid networks are one of the things that make the possibility real of people stopping working and providing for each other through mechanisms that are not driven by the marketplace. That's one piece, but it's also, frankly, kind of long term. And there's stuff that is happening right now that we need to engage in. That's part of why the electoral process, despite the sort of abdication of a great many people who have come to doubt its centrality, because I think for a lot of them, they were new to it and they grew disappointed and they kind of took their eye off the ball thinking it matters less, when it matters just as much as they always thought it did. It just requires other parts to work too. But the electoral process and electoral accountability for the complicit policymakers who have enabled this generation of abuses is critical, because it's the only, well, it's not the only, the courts are one theoretical track that we have, only we've observed how the courts have been co-opted. Congress could impose judicial life tenure, imposed judicial term limits, ending life tenure to force turnover on the bench. That's a structural response to the court, but that's also by Congress, not by communities. A lot of that is to say, a lot of our solutions have to come through representative government. We can do things at the community level, like provide for our neighbors, enable work stoppages. That's important. And some things we can only do at scale. Some things require policy solutions. And so to take our eye off the electoral arena because we recognize how corrupted it is effectively an abdication that will allow the runaway train to continue off the track. And that's exactly, one reason I'm running to replace the leader of the Democrats in the House, is that Democrats have been, unfortunately, under Pelosi's leadership, demonstrably, repeatedly, and remain complicit in this fascist aggrandizement of executive power and the derogation of the rights from one community to the next. And, at the very same day that a bunch of us were marching in the street responding to the leak of Alito's draft opinion, she was in Texas raising money for the last anti-choice Democrat in the House. And frankly, that demands accountability. And as long as I'm on that, I should note that she also failed to codify Roe when Democrats held the Senate, which could have passed 10 years ago. She was the Speaker of the House then. It's not like they didn't know it was a problem. She promised it would happen. Obama promised it would happen, and they both developed other priorities. The cynical view of this is that the reason they developed other priorities is that they needed a cash cow, and you can raise money off of an issue that you haven't secured. And they literally chose to do that, putting the party's interests before fundamental rights that they left on the floor for the right-wing Supreme Court to now come and shred. That is a failure, a dramatic failure that demands accountability. And even that's not all. Pelosi could have stopped Justice Barrett's path to the bench. She had the unique power as the Speaker of the House to preempt the Senate confirmation hearings with the articles of impeachment that she was in the process of slow walking and limiting in order to help our former criminal president, who she was, claiming to resist while tacitly enabling. And at this same time, she was also enabling his nominee. This is the same, she's the octogenarian oligarch from the very same city as Dianne Feinstein, US Senator, who was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee and of those hearings. And Dianne Feinstein, Pelosi's fellow San Franciscan, described those hearings, Justice Barrett's, as the proudest moment of her career. And when Democrats paved the way for right-wing justices to the Supreme Court, as President Biden did when he was a senator for Clarence Thomas, these things demand accountability, right? That might have been a good reason to choose a different president who didn't have a history like that. I think the world might be different if we had, either then or now. But, these are the elections, basically, is the point here. When we elect people who are going to office, and I should make this clear too, people think of elections as a political process. Elections are also a constitutional process. And there's a crucial difference between the two. People who think of them as a political process often get very focused on popularity.
Mm.
Are they going to win? What's he raised? Who's endorsed him? I'm not interested in politics. I could care less. I mean, it's just absolutely meaningless to me. It's just a grand distraction from policy and constitutional issues. I mean, I'm here ultimately as a constitutional agent of accountability to challenge corruption. I didn't run against the Speaker of the House because I thought I could beat her. I ran against the Speaker of the House because someone has to hold her accountable. And ultimately, it's not me poised to beat her. It's a community. It's we, the people of the United States, against an oligarch. And from a political calculus, it seems like suicide, right? Because like, why would you run against power like that? And at the end of the day, I'm not political. I'm constitutional. I'm very happy to do the counter-majoritarian thing in the interest of what has to happen. And at the end of the day, I'm confident that my neighbors are reasonable people who care enough about themselves and their rights in the future that if they are presented with the facts, which many of them have not had an opportunity to hear or see, that they can make better choices. And that's basically my job over the course of this year, is to work around the corporate media wideout, to reach every voter that I can, to talk to people like yourself who do give a damn and are trying to promote this conversation that needs to happen, and alarm and educate and inspire my neighbors to help us carve a different future. And that's something we can only do together.
That's great. So along those lines, well, no, I'm going to back up first. And so it's sort of my perspective, and I could be wrong, is that if we see fascism coming before the death camps open, maybe we can stop it, right? Whereas the Germans and Austrians and Poles probably didn't see it coming because they didn't have the historical long view that we have. If we're going to do more than just be Cassandra, being able to say, yes, we told you so, right? Like what do you think the Germans wish they had done? What are we going to 5 years from now wish we had done?
It's the combination of organizing at the local level, pulling the levers that remain available to maintain representative government before it slips through our fingers. Again, that sort of redounds to mutual aid at the local level, elections at the big level. And that means meeting your neighbors, connecting with campaigns that are challenging entrenched incumbents, volunteering with those campaigns, donating to them, showing up and giving time to defend the future from the past. When I look particularly at, you'd said that if we see the death camps coming, we can stop it before we get there. If there was any one thing I'd really want to get across, it's that fascism emerges even short of that. And it can be no less inexorable. Like the essence of fascism is when people don't realize that they've lost their rights, when they tacitly comply. That is the United States. I mean, we are living through a mass extinction crisis across the globe being driven by Wall Street. We have paramilitary state agents in every community across the country occupying major urban centers. We have millions of people legally enslaved in prisons. We have a mass surveillance across the United States, militarized borders. I mean, I don't think Americans have any idea how deeply entrenched it has already grown because they can get consumer baubles from Amazon. And this distraction, the role that we as consumers and the distraction that it presents from our roles as citizens. And this in San Francisco, for instance, we have a very highly educated, highly compensated, incredibly low attention, low information set of voters. And they just have no idea how the incumbents represented us. And that's largely the fault of the press, ultimately, more than just the voters. But many of them are also unaware of their alternatives. And that's the thing that also I would fault the press for, though, voters have some agency here. And so as you ask, what do we do? I'm imploring your listeners to engage the agency to be part of the solution. And that includes at the local level, find a network near you that's doing something like making sure that leftover food from the grocery store makes it to people who are unhoused. That's a relatively straightforward, at least in communities that haven't criminalized that, straightforward project. And it can make an incredibly huge difference in the lives of the people that are impacted. Everything from that to pooling resources to buy camping equipment for people who are unhoused, providing rides for people who may be transportation challenged, home defense for people facing eviction. These are all examples of mutual aid direct action opportunities. Public education, making sure that your neighbors, ideally working with your neighbors to inform your neighbors about the objects of current events, history, future opportunity that otherwise don't get talked about. That's an opportunity. Every kind of community organizing, from occupations of institutions, like when we occupied the office here in San Francisco in 2 successive years, to policy advocacy campaigns like in 2019, when we managed to get the Board of Supervisors here to put in place a law to restrict biometric surveillance by local authorities, basically a local dimension to that FBI NGI saga I was telling you about before. You know, these federal abuses, you can activate locally at the local level to push back and carve out space to say, okay, our elected officials are going to say, our executive officials, our police department can't buy military spy technology to bring into our city. You can say that. You can push your local members of your city council or county board to do that. Your state elections should be issues where we politicize exactly these kinds of opportunities. And that only happens through electoral engagement. So it's that full spectrum of things. You know, reading and learning always stays really important. I think people's hard to do that all the time. But ultimately, I think meeting your neighbors, finding ways to share your concerns, developing common cause and shared projects to speak your voice, whether that's in an advocacy context, whether that's in a mutual aid context, a direct action context, electorals, lots of different opportunities. And the point is, I think that everybody has to do something, and hopefully a few things. And we're all together going to have to do a lot, because there's a lot at stake if we don't manage to shift the trajectory of these institutions before, you know, you were talking about death camps. I think about this particularly through the lens of like any random person under a US made bomb. And by that standard, you know,
We're already killing people.
We've been killing people. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I know you started talking about your campaign. You talked a lot about the why of your campaign. So what are ways that people can get involved?
Thank you for asking that. I appreciate it. Folks can, from anywhere in the country, donate to the campaign or volunteer with us. I'll explain quickly how to do either of those things. Our website's shahidforchange.us. Short link is shahid.fyi. We're on all those social media platforms at Shahid for Change, and things that volunteers are doing from anywhere in the country include helping amplify the campaign on social media, making calls either to voters or to volunteers to encourage them to come out to any of our local mobilizations. We've got opportunities in presenting our campaign to the press, opportunities in helping set up private gatherings with supporters who are introducing us to other people, graphic design, video editing, lots of opportunities, lots of people plugging in, and anybody's welcome to join us.
Great. And for people who know Shahid but don't know Conversations Against Fascism, there's an opportunity to join our Facebook group. I'm going to be re-airing this on the Facebook page, and there's a post right underneath for joining the Facebook group. And we're going to be having workshop coming up on finding your best leverage point. Like, what can you personally do that's based on who you are and where you are that will make the biggest difference. And we are the only, I believe, we are the group and the page called Conversations Against Fascism on Facebook. So you can search up for us that way or search through my name. So amazing to be with you, Shahid, and like your wisdom and your sense of what's going on. Just
You're kind. The honor's mine.
provide something I can't get anywhere else. What was that?
The honor's mine. Thanks for having me on. I'm aware of that sort of like arc over 10 years of that discussion. And I lament that we're still in this position, but I'm grateful for your, help bringing these issues to a broader audience. I'm looking forward to checking out your future sessions and your future guests.
Amazing. All right. Thanks, Shahid. I'm going to stop recording.